Following JFK's assassination, civil rights leaders are concerned. So they've spent all of JFK's administration up to his assassination trying to win him over, trying to push him to put in place legislation to get rid of these polling taxes, these literacy tests, legislation to prevent private businesses from discriminating against people based on their color. And just when it looked like they had finally achieved their goal, JFK is assassinated, and now we're going to have his vice president, this Texan, this guy named Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, take over for Kennedy. And they don't have any idea what to expect about him. He's been largely silent on civil rights issues. Well, to talk about how LBJ is going to react to civil rights, we need to do a little bit of background on him. So LBJ was raised poor. He's from Central Texas, grew up in the hill country, and spent a lot of his youth without electricity, things like that. As a young man, he's going to goes to school at Texas State. It's now Texas State. He's going to graduate and he's going to become a teacher. He's going to spend some time on the Texas-Mexican border, teaching young Mexican-American children how to read, write, and that kind of thing. He actually became frustrated at this job because he would see the beginning of the year the children be enthusiastic, but then he saw as the year would go by more and more families removing their children from school, having to go out to the fields and work. And as Johnson saw that, they're not going to have any opportunity to advance themselves without education. He grew a little bit frustrated during that. During the Great Depression, LBJ is going to end up working for the national government. He gets employment in one of FDR's New Deal programs, and that's going to keep him employed through the Great Depression. During World War II, LBJ will serve in the Navy. When he gets back from World War II, he's going to run for office in Texas. Eventually, in 1948, he will run as a senator, or to be one of Texas's 2 senators to the United States Senate. The election is going to be pretty crazy. LBJ is going to be one of the first to use helicopters. He's going to go around making these campaign speeches. I should point out the main election in Texas is for the Democratic primary. So Texas, 1948, whoever wins the Democratic primary wins. The Republican Party, as we've been talking about, had essentially died in Texas following Reconstruction. So in this Democratic primary, LBJ is doing all this crazy stuff, yelling out of a helicopter to beat his opponent. His opponent's trying to counter his campaigning, try to prevent this upstart from taking a Senate seat. Well, LBJ will end up winning barely this 1948 Senate election, and he's only going to win because at the very last second, 200 votes exactly are going to come from one Texas county, and this is going to give LBJ the edge over his opponent. Well, later on, historians are going to look at these last-minute people voting for LBJ, and they're going to find these 200 people from this county sent the votes in at the last second. Just so happens that every single one of them voted for LBJ, and it just so happens that all of them lined up in alphabetical order to vote. So you have whatever Albright, and then whatever Britain, A's, and then B's, and then C's. So they happen to all vote for LBJ, happen to be in alphabetical order, and all of them happen to be dead. So what had actually happened is an LBJ supporter had just made up a number of votes, sent them in, and LBJ wins the Texas Senate seat. Once he gets in the Senate for Texas, LBJ will serve the Democratic Party for Texas, and he's going to be a major supporter of New Deal programs. So to LBJ, he admired FDR. He thought the government should be an agency of reform, not just in traditional democratic sense with economics, but also social sense. Now, he's not going to make this very public, like he doesn't make address Truman's integration of the Army or anything based on race issues, because being from Texas, that would be a career suicide in the Democratic Party there. But it is apparent that he is a New Deal Democrat. Now, just how far he is a New Deal Democrat and how far he's talking about stepping into social issues, that awaits to be seen. So, as we mentioned, LBJ will be put on the presidential ticket for JFK in 1960 to counter Kennedy's Northeast appeal and to get Southern voters to stick with the Democratic Party. Hey, we know we got this Massachusetts guy running, but we also have this good old boy Texan. He's a traditional Southern Democrat, and again, this is going to win. As we mentioned, LBJ, JFK, not going to have the best relationship, but a lot of times they'll sort of be hostile to one another. LBJ looks at JFK as the spoiled rich kid. LBJ grew up poor. Kennedy grew up really well in Massachusetts. Johnson, very interesting character, very crude. The guy liked to cuss. He would make dirty jokes all the time. When he becomes president, he's going to be doing things like I don't even want to say some of this stuff, but not minding going to the bathroom in front of reporters, making comments about how, I'm not going to even say it. You guys can look it up. But he's incredibly crude, incredibly dirty jokes, this type of thing. Probably like Kennedy, he was a philanderer. As a matter of fact, he would get upset whenever people would talk about how many women JFK would slept with. LBJ claimed he slept with more than JFK. He would be upset at the assertion JFK slept with more women, which is, you can imagine his wife, Lady Bird. Lady Bird Johnson's going to be upset at this aspect of his character. So you've got this crude guy. You've got this guy from Texas, this it's seemingly, in some ways, old school Democrat, a guy who has taken very little stance on civil rights, entering office just after JFK dies. If you're somebody like MLK, you don't know what to think. You're basically thinking all the work you've put in with JFK has come to naught. Well, MLK and civil rights leaders, instead of being frustrated with LBJ, they're going to find a stalwart ally. Now, and we'll see LBJ is going to support all sorts of civil rights legislation, and he's going to work very closely with MLK and other civil rights leaders to pass some momentous legislation in support of civil rights. Now, why does he do this? Some people say it's because LBJ, growing up fairly poor, sees this about economics. Blacks in general are poor. This is sort of this struggle to help them improve their lives, like I had to work to improve my life. Some people think this is a New Deal Democrat thing. Again, he had benefited from the New Deal, so he thinks the national government should help the little guy. And this is the extent of that, is helping out the people that are poor using the national government, and it just so happens African Americans are poor. Some people think it's a political stunt. He sees that the national attention national support has gone behind civil rights, the various sit-ins, all the protests, has finally grabbed the public consciousness and said, we need to do something about this. LBJ may be power hungry. As a matter of fact, some people say his political ambition is going to be the thing driving him here. I don't think that's the case. I genuinely think that he is concerned. He is also ambitious. And when you combine those two things together, there's going to be very little to get in LBJ's way of passing civil rights legislation. So right from the beginning, we see LBJ and MLK start pushing major civil rights reforms. And as a matter of fact, LBJ is going to use Kennedy's assassination as a rallying cry. He says, let us continue. That'll be his quote. And he says, JFK had started to talk about this. Let's finish it. And almost immediately, LBJ is going to come out and start calling for some major legislation. One thing he's going to say is the 24th Amendment, let's approve this. So somebody had introduced an amendment to Congress saying that the poll tax needs to go away. Well, that had gotten through Congress. LBJ is going to say to states, again, presidents aren't directly involved in the amendment process, but they can encourage Congress and then the states to approve of new amendments. So he's going to push states to approve this new amendment saying no longer can you charge people to vote. That goes away. Again, this had affected not just poor blacks, poor whites, poor anybody, but it had more adversely affected African Americans than any other group in the United States. So that's going to be passed shortly after LBJ takes over. The big thing that LBJ is going to push through is something that is going to be incredibly controversial. And this is going to be something called the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So MLK had been asking JFK to push through legislation saying that private companies, so this could be Woolworths, although Woolworths, owing to the sit-ins, had removed its policy of segregating its counters. But what about other major companies that still have segregationist policies? What about mom and pop shop that won't allow blacks to eat in the dining room? What about this contractor over here that refuses to hire black workers? Well, MLK is going to argue that if we have this type of racism, even if it's not from the government, this is going to eternally keep African Americans down. Well, how do you change that? Can the federal government step in and tell Joe Schmo who owns a business who you can hire, who you can't hire, who you can serve? Well, what the Civil Rights Act is going to say is that the federal government has a constitutional right to regulate interstate trade. So that's in the Constitution. That had been put in as a provision after the Articles of Confederation. You saw states basically passing duties on one another, and it hurt the economy of the early United States. So this is basically saying the only one that can regulate interstate trade is the national government. Well, over time, this interstate commerce clause had been used to do other things, and we'd seen it before being used to regulate child labor. So basically, what the national government said, if you're a business that does a company that does business over interstate lines, you can't hire children under a certain age. And they passed this law. The Supreme Court had found it constitutional. Well, what MLK and civil rights leaders are going to argue with Johnson is, why don't we use that same provision saying that if you're a company that does business over interstate lines, you cannot discriminate against who you serve? Well, even still, that would limit mom and pop shop would still be able to discriminate because they're, in one town, they're not discriminating over interstate lines. Well, the Civil Rights Act will be using this idea that mom and pop shop is still probably buying sugar from overseas. So you're talking about international trade there, which the federal government can regulate. It's probably using flour from a different state. So that's coming over interstate lines. So basically, if you're serving the general public, then that ties you to interstate trade. So unless you're a private organization, unless you're a private club, if you're serving the general public, you're going to be involved in this. This can tie you to this interstate commerce clause. It's kind of a stretch, but LBJ is going to buy this argument. He and Congress will write up this Civil Rights Act that says, again, you cannot discriminate based on race in who you hire, who you serve. Well, this is going to be problematic because a lot of people in Congress don't like this idea. They think this is the government going too far. And there are a lot of Republicans thinking this. Republicans, by this point, have become the small government party. Again, after the reform branch had fallen off, they're just about pro-business, smaller government. They'd added this anti-communism element to their party. But this is the government going too far, getting doing too much, being involved in private businesses. It's also going to face resistance from within LBJ's own party, white Southern Democrats. Again, white Southern society had been based on segregation. Sure, you've had reforms in government positions. Now, no longer are schools being segregated, or they're supposed to no longer be segregating based on race after Brown v. Board of Education. But you still have segregated businesses. This would basically completely crumble that if this was passed through. So LBJ is going to have a tough road ahead. Basically, he's going to have to go out to Congress, convince people this is a good idea, He's going to try to make promises to both members of the Republican Party and calm down this southern branch of this Democratic Party. A lot of these white southern Democrats are not going to be convinced, and he's still going to have a difficult time. Well, during this process, as the bill goes through the House and then the Senate, as it's going through, the bill can be edited before final approval. Somebody, according to this story that I've heard is apocryphal, I also heard it's truthful, but a Virginia congressman named Howard Smith wanted the bill to be defeated, didn't want to have desegregation of private businesses. So in order to do that, he said businesses can no longer discriminate based on sex in hiring or who you serve. So if a bar said we don't want to serve women, that's now illegal. Or technically, if you still have girls' night or something like that, that's going to be illegal to this if this provision is added on. So some people think it was a poison pill, this sex thing. No longer can you discriminate against somebody based on their sex. So if you have two people apply for a job, one's a white man, black man, white woman, black woman, whoever. None of those factors are supposed to be in play. Now, of course, other things can be a factors in who you hire, but sex and race. Well, Smith puts this in thinking it will get defeated. Instead, the bill gets pushed through anyway, and it not only gets pushed through, but LBJ is able to get 60 members of the Senate to approve it. This is important because there's a new practice, I shouldn't say new, fairly new practice, that opponents to the legislation have been using called the filibuster, whereas if a bill comes up and it's got a simple majority, which is what, per the Constitution, what a bill needs to pass to go to the president's desk, but if it's got a simple majority, you filibuster it until the legislation dies. And what this would mean is you get up and you continue to talk, and you continue to talk, and you continue to talk, and if it's at the end of a legislative session, people go home instead of the bill being passed through. But you can override a filibuster if you have 60 senators to do this. So Johnson ends up getting 60 senators to agree to pass this legislation. It goes through the House, goes through the Senate, and it's going to go to Johnson's desk, and Johnson will pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And this is a picture of him signing this legislation. It's a pretty momentous moment. He's going to sign it. He's got actually a number of different pens. He signs multiple copies of it, and he's going to start handing out these pens. It's kind of interesting because one of the people attending this signing of the Civil Rights Act is John F. Kennedy's brother, Robert Kennedy. And Robert Kennedy's kind of got a look at what Johnson's seeing here. And again, this is going to be overwhelming public approval for what he's doing outside of the South. And he sees Johnson getting this praise for it. You can kind of see on RFK's face, this could have been my brother. And sort of making matters worse, some people say LBJ kind of like to rub it in his face. He's like, here, Robert, you can have a pen for helping me with this. So I don't know if that part's true, but definitely it's true that RFK is going to wish his brother had been one to sign this, not Johnson. So this is a tremendous piece of legislation. Now, as we'll talk about, there's going to be constitutional questions about it. The Supreme Court's going to rule that it is indeed constitutional. There's you could certainly argue the other way, but the Supreme Court's going to rule that no, this does fall under the Interstate Commerce Clause. So this legislation goes through. It's not going to be immediate desegregation of private hotels, restaurants, that type of thing, but it's going to be coming over the ensuing years. One interesting fallout from this is immediately after this is signed, this guy right here is named Strom Thurmond. He had been at the heart of the Dixiecrats, the Southern white Democrats that didn't like the New Deal. They loved the fact that the Democratic Party would support the little guy as far as economics, because white Southern Democrats had benefited from that. They benefited from the Agricultural Adjustment Act and a lot of the other reforms that the Democratic Party had done at the national level. But again, they've been wary of this social legislation. Well, now you have this, and what you'll see is these Dixiecrats with Strom Thurmond at their lead are going to say, I don't want to be a part of this party anymore. Within 2 months of passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964, this guy, Strom Thurmond, senator from South Carolina politician, will leave the Democratic Party and join the Republican Party. So this is very representative of what we're about to see happen. This isn't going to be all white Southerners immediately defect to the Republican Party. It's going to take a little while. But basically what happens here is a lot of white Southerners look at the party that had been their party since before the Civil War, and they say, if my party means enforcing civil rights or promoting civil rights, I'd rather go to the Republican Party that means small government. So I like big government as far as economics, but if we're talking big government as far as civil rights and equal rights for blacks, then I'd rather not have the big government, and I'd rather go to this Republican Party. So Strom Thurmond and another number of white Southern Democrats switched to the Republican Party in the aftermath of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And actually some of Johnson's advisors had warned him about this. You're losing our Southern base, the base that we've held not forever, for the past 120, 30 years. What Johnson supposedly says is, I know the risks are great and we might lose the South, but those sorts of states might be left anyway, or might be lost anyway. So Johnson makes this decision, and some people think this is going to hurt him in the 1964 election because he's going to run for his first election on his own. But in fact, this is going to help him. But what we see in this 1964 election, you don't need to know about the Republican he runs against, a guy named Barry Goldwater. He's basically running on this small government platform. But if you look at this, this is a complete reversal of the elections we've seen since before the Civil War. This is the Democratic Party base here in the Deep South. Well, what happens in 1964 is this switches to Republican. Again, most Southerners, Reconstruction, most white Southerners would not think to vote Republican. That's the party of Lincoln. That's the party of reform, Reconstruction. But now, if it means our party is switching to help civil rights, we're going to switch to this Republican Party. Now, as we'll talk about, it's not going to be a complete switch, and we'll see throughout the 1960s, 1970s, and at least a little bit into the 1980s, there's going to be this back and forth between the Democrats and Republicans. But clearly from this thing, you've had this major party switch, and it comes about right after the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But again, Johnson, if you're concerned about doing something that appeals nationally, this is absolutely a smart decision, because everybody else outside of the South, Barry Goldwater's from Arizona, so don't worry about that, but everybody else is in favor of the civil rights legislation. So, and Johnson, look, this is a significant victory in the popular vote. He wins by over 20%. Huge electoral vote. So this is immensely popular. Well, after this, when Johnson starts his second administration, the civil rights leaders, MLK, other civil rights leaders, are going to obviously be congratulatory here. Thanks, Mr. President. We needed your help with this legislation. But they want to go further. This doesn't solve all problems for blacks in the South. And in particular, there's still this issue of literacy tests. So, as we've talked about, the poll tax is now gone. There's now this constitutional amendment saying you can't have a poll tax. And now, again, there's going to be less discrimination in services. There'll still be extra legal ways to get around it, to discriminate. But what about this literacy test? And what about all these blacks that were not able to vote prior to this point? What about this huge discrepancy in registration? So what had happened in the following the elimination of the poll tax is that a lot of southern white-controlled governments will start making it difficult to register to vote. The thinking being that where very few could vote prior to the elimination of the poll tax. So if we limit who new people who can register to vote, so states register to people to vote. As we've talked about, states are the ones that hold elections for national offices. They set the rules for elections. So if we're registering people to vote, we want to make sure that whites maintain power. And this is going to be particularly in areas like Alabama, Mississippi, where you have roughly equal white and black populations. So what they'll do is they'll say, if we limit new people registering to vote, that means few blacks get registered to vote, which means that whites who've been registered to vote for a long time are going to be the ones doing the voting. So what you'll start to see is civil rights leaders will encourage black voters to start registering. But again, instead of registering to vote or opening registration 6 days a week as it maybe been previously, you'll have towns like this. This is Selma, Alabama. What they'll do is they'll close registration days to once a month. And so you can only come in on the first Friday every month. I'm sort of being a little simplistic here. You can only come in on the first Friday every month. And they put a person that's incredibly slow at registering to vote in charge of the counter. So what this means is that you might have now 1,000 blacks from the town now able to vote because of elimination of the poll tax. They all want to vote, but this person's only going to get through 10 people a day. So you're waiting in line all day, and then you're the 12th person in line. Oh, sorry, you got to come back next Friday. How many people are going to do that? We'd all like to think that we would wait 20, Mondays in a row to be able to register to vote, but the reality is most of us just don't have the time to do that. And a lot of times what you would actually see is you maybe wait all day, maybe you'd get in. They'd have these literacy tests. They'd have two very different versions of literacy tests. Say you're very well educated, you can read and write, and you've got a literacy test, which hey, I'm going to admit, I think, maybe a test to see if you understand the government's not a bad idea. But the thing that's going to make those things really bad is that you'll have one over here saying one thing, and you give this one pretty simple, basic understanding of government just to whites, and they'll tell the person behind the desk, give version B if a black person comes up to register to vote. And this version of the literacy test will be extremely complicated questions, and it'll ask things that even a genius would not be able to answer. Somebody that studied intently, no matter their race, no matter their background, whatever, they're not going to be able to pass this one. So whites get version A, blacks get version B, and we know that they're not going to pass version B because nobody could pass version B. So what this is going to mean is that, all right, you have this reform, but these literacy tests and these sort of slow process of registration are preventing blacks from getting the right to vote. Well, in response to this, MLK is going to say to LBJ, so MLK will go to LBJ and he's going to say, we need voter rights reform. We need the national government to override the states and send registrars to the South. We need them to set up registration stations. We need them to monitor, police these cities like Selma to where they can where they're allowed to get the blacks to be able to register. We can't just leave this up to states and local authorities because we're never going to get the right to vote, even though with these changes. So MLK will call on LBJ to do this. 1965 LBJ, he's dealing with a lot of anti-communism stuff. A lot of people are criticizing LBJ, saying, hey, these social reform measures, they're tiptoeing on socialism, eventually maybe tiptoeing on communism. So he's facing some pressure from there. He's got this issues in this country of Vietnam we briefly talked about before. He's dealing with that. So he's going to say to MLK, I can't get to this at the moment. I can't deal with voting at the moment. Sorry, let's just hold off. I'll get to it in the future. Well, MLK had seen what happens when you wait. Sometimes this stuff doesn't get done. So what he's going to decide to do, and he and leaders of the NAACP, is organize a march in this particularly bad town of Selma that was really bad about registering people to vote, and organize a march to try to bring attention to the issue. And again, they're going to pick Selma because they understand the police of Selma are reactionaries. As a matter of fact, there'd been peaceful protest not long before protesting registration policies. The lights had gone out, and the police had basically turned off the lights, and they'd started beating protesters, telling them to disperse. Claiming it had been a riot, that type of thing. So again, we want to go to a place where we're going to get the biggest reaction, because this is going to tell people in the North and the West, we need this change. Again, bring this attention to it, this sort of publicity campaign. So the first of a series of marches will be conducted on March 7th, 1965. Again, LBJ's a little hesitant about it. He thinks that MLK and NAACP is moving a little too fast with this, but they're going to go on anyway, and we're going to see at Selma, March 7th, 1965. Initially, it's just going to be about 1,000 marchers. They'll try to proceed from Selma to the capital of Alabama, Montgomery, where they're going to meet on the steps of the state capitol in protest. Well, as they depart Selma, the governor of Alabama will claim that the marchers are a threat to public safety, and he's going to call out these state troopers, and they and local Selma police are going to tell the marchers to disperse. You can't proceed to the Capitol. This is an illegal march. Well, the marchers are going to try to push through peacefully, and they're going to do this, again, knowing that the media's sitting here on the sides, and they're going to be attempt to walk through the police. Well, the police, being reactionary, again, somewhat planned, will start beating these protesters. They'll start firing tear gas into the marchers, start beating them and telling them to disperse, and they're going to prevent the marchers from getting to Alabama. The event's going to be called Bloody Sunday because the level of the police brutality. Well, 2 days later, more people are going to show up as media coverage brings this to light. And we're going to have 2,500 people set out to do the same thing, to march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. This is going to include, civil rights reformers from throughout the country. Well, as they're marching, the police will once again tell the marchers to disperse. They're going to again refuse to, but not react violently. And the police again are going to react by starting to fire tear gas and starting to beat protesters. And during this second march, a white minister who had been marching with the protesters will be beat to death by Alabama State Police. Well, obviously this is too far, but to civil rights leaders, this is just going to be good in the fact that it's going to bring attention to what's going on here. And you'll see that after this, there's going to be this national attention drawn to it. Magazine coverage of this will be what's going on down here in Selma. There'll be a lot. This will be all over news, and again, just about everybody has a TV by this point. People are going to see what's happening down here, and this is going to be bringing this issue of voter registration to the American public. Well, as a result of this, even more people will show up in Selma to join this protest or to join the march. And by March 21st, over 8,000 people by this point had arrived to do a third and final march. And this one is going to be attended by MLK, and these marchers are going to set out on March 21st. By this point, the governor of Alabama, he realizes that sending the troops out is a bad decision. It's actually helping the marchers, and then the marchers will be able to proceed to Montgomery. By the time they arrived, the marchers had increased in number to 25,000. So what we saw here is, again, this reaction to protests and the bringing of light to the American public this issue, particularly affecting African Americans. Well, as a result of these Selma marches, what you're going to see is that basically anybody outside of the South who had been unaware of these voting marches or voting rights issues are now going to be drawn to this. Okay, this is if you don't know what the situation is in the South, you do now. This is not going to just be an issue within the United States. Internationally, this is going to be shown. Soviet television will be saying, "Hey, look what Americans are doing to their citizens. They're keeping blacks down. There's no equality in the United States." So it's an embarrassment, not just within the United States, but outside the United States. LBJ is going to look at this and say, I need to do something. Okay, I got to put this other stuff to the side, and I've got to deal with this. And you'll see LBJ in 1965 introduce something to Congress. Congress is going to approve something called the Voting Rights Act. Okay, so the Voting Rights Act in 1965 will ban the literacy tests. So any tests that are going to be used, to restrict voters, those are no longer allowed per this Voting Rights Act. And it's going to call on federal registrars to go to the South to help people register to vote. Again, you've had, prior to this, you had states, local governments restricting registration intentionally to prevent blacks from registering to vote. Now you're going to have federal government officials coming down to help with this registration. This is going to dramatically increase voting in the United States, particularly in the South. And it's not just among black voters, but once this happens, you're now going to have contests in the South for certain states. Again, if blacks are now able to vote, and they're going to be voting Democrat now because who's the ones that are passing this legislation? You're going to see a lot of white voters. Again, not all are going to completely abandon the Democratic Party, but now more of them are going to vote. Before all of this reform, even white voters didn't vote, not only because the poll tax and literacy test didn't allow some poor whites to vote, but because the main contest was in the Democratic primary. But now we're having this huge contest where there previously hadn't been anything. So if you're a proponent of democracy, this is absolutely going to be a boon for democracy. So dramatically increases voting rights, voting in the South. Johnson's not going to stop there with civil rights legislation. He's going to continue to do other civil rights reform. For example, as an executive order, Johnson will say, we need to increase the number of African Americans and other minorities in the federal government. So as an executive order, he orders this affirmative action. Now, you'll sometimes see people confuse what affirmative action is. It's not a quota, anything like that. The word comes from when Johnson issues this executive order saying, I want affirmative action to try to increase the number of blacks in government. He's not saying this for private businesses. Basically, for private businesses, the only thing they got to worry about is that Civil Rights Act. If it's intentionally shows that they're discriminating in hiring or service, that's illegal. But as long as you're not doing that, you're fine. You don't have to meet a quota or anything like that. But what Johnson does with his affirmative action is just says in the federal government, we're going to make an effort to increase the number of minorities in positions of power. And in this regard, Johnson's actually going to appoint a new Supreme Court justice. One dies during his presidency. He's going to decide to appoint Thurgood Marshall. So we're going to see our first African-American Supreme Court justice in 1967. Again, Thurgood Marshall, the guy who had been a lawyer for the NAACP in Sweatt v. Painter and Brown versus Board of Education. Again, this isn't going to be the end of Johnson's reforms, because Johnson is going to take on this almost... basically, he's going to continue to push the reforms, not just for African Americans, but for all disenfranchised Americans, poor whites, Mexicans, blacks, groups who have not had equal opportunity. And Johnson's going to try to deal with all this economic inequality and something he's going to call the Great Society. So Johnson thought FDR was his hero. He was his hero. So he thought the New Deal and this sort of measure to help out the average guy, the little guy, was great. Johnson determines that he wants to have equal opportunity throughout the United States. And he wants to basically finish the New Deal, would be almost how he would phrase it. So I'm going to go further than that. I'm going to use the national government as this major institute of change, and I'm going to give people more opportunities, not just blacks, not just whites, but anybody who's been disenfranchised. Give them a chance to get forward in life. We're going to give everybody in the United States an opportunity. Now, what he will do is he's going to start pushing programs called the Job Corps. With the Job Corps, it's almost like the Civilian Conservation Corps, but this is going to take young people who might not have any skills, might not have proper education, couldn't afford to get an education, something like that. You can go to the Job Corps and you can learn how to be a mechanic. You can learn how to be a carpenter, something like that. And after doing basically an apprenticeship for a period of time, you're out of the Job Corps, and now you have skills you can contribute to society, you can feed your family, you can make money off of that. LBJ is going to put a ton of money into education. So we already had federal funding going to the GI Bill. Well, what LBJ will do is he's going to pass something like 24 different pieces of legislation, and what this is going to be is to provide scholarships for people of that maybe couldn't afford to go to college. This is going to provide money so universities can expand, hire new faculty, build new dorms, build new buildings to accommodate a larger student population, so we can start getting more people to school, and then providing with education again to give more opportunity, things like that. Now, this is one of these things. It's not just going to be colleges. He'll actually do this for high schools. He's going to start providing federal funding for middle schools, elementary schools. One of the things he's going to put on this additional federal funding is, hey, if you want this to happen, you got to make sure your schools are integrated. So we've seen people dragging their feet on integration. If basically we determine that you're intentionally segregating, drawing your school districts around, the black neighborhood, you're not going to get this federal funding. So if you're Joe Schmo school district in the South and you want this extra, $50,000 or whatever, you're going to make sure that you integrate. So this will be one thing Johnson does. He's going to push new social welfare programs. Two of these are going to be Medicare and Medicaid. Basically, this is a system that will provide health insurance for the poor and the elderly. Again, people that might not be able to afford it otherwise. And Johnson is going to be one of the first to push through environmental legislation. So this, I don't know if you would call this civil rights legislation, equal opportunity legislation, but the United States, as it's industrialized, there had been factories, and these factories would create air pollution, water pollution, and these would adversely affect people in inner cities, the poor, people who couldn't afford to move. Well, what Johnson will do in 1965 is pass this Water Quality Act, and this is going to have the federal government now regulate what companies can put into the water. So if you have cities like Chicago, Detroit, something like that, again, a company dumps all these chemicals into the water, and this is going to adversely affect the health of people that can't afford to deal with this stuff. Now this is going to provide at least some regulation. A lot of people are going to say it's not going to go far enough, and they're going to be called for greater environmental regulation. That'll come later, but here's step one, this Water Quality Act. So all of this is going to increase the size of government. You would expect that it's going to come with increased taxation. That's actually going to be opposite of the case. So when Johnson's in office, the United States is going to go through this economic boom where basically the average American post-World War II is continuing to spend, continuing to do well, buying homes, buying cars, and U.S. industry is continuing to burgeon, whereas again, the U.S.'s competitors, except for the Soviet Union, are continuing to have losses. Again, Britain and France are losing their colonies at this time. So the average American's making more money. So Johnson, while he's doing all these reforms, he is actually able to reduce taxes on the ultra wealthy. So during World War II, the tax on the upper percentage of Americans, so that top 1% or so, had been 90%. During Johnson administration, he's going to reduce that down to 65%. And he would say that, we don't need, even though I'm doing all these reforms, we don't need these additional taxes. And he's also hoping that this will spur the very wealthy to invest more. And he's going to reduce taxes on the people sort of at the bottom from 20%, which they'd been during World War II, down to 14%. So he's able to accomplish this because the U.S. is doing well. Johnson's also going to do labor reform. And in this way, it's actually going to intersect. Before this, on some of the educational reform, you're going to see that beginning with the integration of schools and continuing with a lot of this federal funding, this is going to have a pretty significant effect, because not only are we going to see the number of total people graduate from high school dramatically increase, you see the blacks start to get almost equal to whites in high school graduation. But to near to present time. So these numbers go up, and again, Johnson is going to be responsible for some of the most dramatic gains of it. Again, some had come before him as well. Johnson will also do labor reform and immigration reform. Again, he's going to work with this Mexican-American civil rights movement. It's going along concurrently with the African-American civil rights movement. But the Mexican-American civil rights movement is somewhat more fractured. You have disagreements about whether to promote immigration from Mexico, and then you have people that at this point of Mexican descent, some had been here before the U.S.-Mexico War, and before areas of the Southwest and Texas had become part of the United States. And then you'd had generations that had been here since the Mexican Revolution. Some Mexican Americans are fully American, speaking English, living here for a long time. Then you have some recent arrivals, and we talked about this when we talked about the 1924 Immigration Act. It said nothing about immigration from Mexico or the Americas. So you'd actually seen, as the United States economy is doing well, a lot of immigrants, particularly from Mexico, had come in and started working in the United States. Well, to some Mexican Americans, this immigration will hurt their efforts because you're going to have this incoming labor undercut sitting Mexican Americans, laborers. They're seeing somebody come in from outside the country now, taking their jobs, working for cheaper than them. And so you're going to have this divided Mexican American labor movement. Well, some will say, let's embrace these newcomers. Others are going to say, let's embrace our Americanness, push back against these labor reformers. Well, Johnson and actually John F. Kennedy's brother, RFK, will make overtures to this Mexican labor movement, and they're actually going to encourage people to buy from companies that don't mistreat Mexican laborers. And this is at the advice of this guy named Cesar Chavez. He's a labor reformer. A lot of people think of him as a civil rights reformer, but he's a labor reformer that is going to bring to the plight the late Mexican American laborers. Now, Cesar Chavez, he's not one of those that says, we should actually support Mexican laborers because he thinks they're undercutting Mexican American labor. So he's actually going to encourage this labor reform where you reduce immigration from the Americas. Again, the Americas had not been excluded during the 1924 Immigration Act. That's actually going to change in 1965 with this Hart-Sellers Act. What the Hart-Sellers Act will do is it's now going to add quotas from all countries to the United States. So we're now going to limit immigration from the Americas as well. And again, this is going to be encouraged by the Mexican American population. Although the Hart-Sellers Act is going to be specifically aimed at reducing the racism of the 1924 Immigration Act. So if you guys remember that had basically put quotas per country of origin, again, outside of the Americas. So we can have a lot of people coming in from England or France or other Northern European countries, very few coming from Eastern European countries, Southern European countries, almost no Asian immigration. Well, what the Hart-Sellers Act does is it gets rid of that quota system, and it changes it to now a family-based system. So if you have people living in the United States and they have family overseas, regardless of where they're from, they're going to receive precedence over, people from others requesting immigration. And as far as filling up the rest of the numbers of people who can come to the United States, there'll be almost a lottery system set up. So if you're somebody that has a cousin in the United States and you're, say, from Russia, before the Hart-Sellers Act of 1965, you're probably not going to be allowed in. But if you had a cousin there, maybe you'll be allowed in now. And instead of limiting it to, I'm making up a number here, 1% of people can come from Russia. Now it'll be just random, selected from all countries throughout the world. So this Hart-Sellers Act is actually trying to undercut sort of the racist system that had been put in place by 1924, anti-certain country system that had been put in place. And actually the Hart-Sellers immigration system is the one that still exists today. All right, so Johnson had made these major reforms. He'd started building this great society. And as a result of this, we are going to start seeing this more opportunities for, again, not just blacks, Mexicans, but for whites as well. And it appears that, he's going to continue with these domestic policies into perhaps a third administration, because he'd taken over for Kennedy with less than 2 years to go on Kennedy's first administration, which, according to that new amendment limiting the president to 2 terms, Johnson could actually run for a second term on his own. So 1968, he could run on his own since he had only taken over at the end of Kennedy's first administration, and his great society could start flourishing. Unfortunately for LBJ, his attention is going to start getting focused elsewhere. He's going to have to start paying attention to these issues going on in Vietnam. We'll talk about those later. But with Johnson's attention withdrawn from the United States, we'll see a lot of people will lose interest in not just the Great Society, but civil rights as a whole. And it's going to lose even further interest, or I should say, it's going to lose further organization when we see in 1968 MLK will be assassinated. He's outside of this Memphis hotel. A shot is going to ring out, shattering his jaw, severing his spinal cord. He's assassinated by a guy named James Earl Ray, an escaped felon who had worked on this segregationist politician's campaign. Shoots MLK. Eventually, James Earl Ray will be caught. But without MLK's influence, and it's not just because he dies, but some other issues had arisen, we start to see the civil rights movement start to break apart. And you're going to start to see some more radical organizations such as the Black Panthers start to emerge. And they're going to start saying that we should go beyond this nonviolent approach and we should adopt violence, or we should do whatever ends necessary to end this equality in the future. Now, this may seem extreme to us nowadays, but the reforms that Johnson and MLK had made to this point, they're going to cause change and they're going to be productive in the long run. But if you're somebody who's black in the 1960s, forget about future generations. Sure, you realize that what these changes are going to be good for future generations, but what about now? What about for my children? I want major reform. And without MLK sort of saying we've got to just focus on the future, you'll see this Black Power movement start to emerge, and other organizations, other sort of militant organizations, this Chicano movement, will start becoming more violent and pushing for more violent, immediate answers. And this is going to actually have the adverse effect of turning voters against this civil rights movement. So by 1968, we see this civil rights movement start to take a side, start to sort of be pushed to the side as the civil rights movement becomes more radicalized. And and we'll see a lot less reform being made past this point. Before we end this, I do want to point out that there are going to be some advances in the women's rights movement during this time, but most of these advances aren't going to be are going to be indirectly tied to the Black Civil Rights Movement, or they're going to come about without government reform. So there had been one of the things we had talked about was in 1964, the Civil Rights Act, saying you could not discriminate based on sex as well as race. That's obviously going to be beneficial for women because no longer this is going to start uh, putting restrictions in who people hire. So if you discriminate based on sex, you could face fines or jail for violating the Civil Rights Act. So obviously that's beneficial to women. Perhaps the biggest benefit to women isn't going to be something that's going to come about as government legislation, but the fact that in the 1950s, a prescription or a medicine had been developed to prevent birth control. This is going to be approved by the FDA, and it's going to start being put up for sale in the 1960s. And this might not seem like a big deal, but if you're a woman and prior to this time, you get pregnant, your life goes on hold for 9 months. So what's your career? What's going to happen with your career um, uh, during this time? And then you're going to have to be a homemaker. And again, you have this sort of male-dominated society where the men certainly are going to stay at home and take care of the child. So your career would have to be put on hold based on if you have sex. Well, with the birth control, that's no longer going to limit you. You can basically choose when to put your career on hold to have a child. And we'll see when this starts to become readily available in the 1960s, women can live their careers longer. It's not going to be, or serving their careers longer before getting pregnant. And it's going to become a choice when this happens instead of sort of this adverse effect. You will see some legislation during this time that will also push for women's rights. There's going to be something called the Equal Pay Act, and this will make it a federal requirement that women should receive equal pay for equal work. And another federal legislation, and this comes about as the increased federal funding to universities. If universities are receiving federal funding, then they can no longer, they have to provide equal scholarships to women as they do for men. Now, this is going to count for sciences, math, things like that. The area that's going to become most controversial, however, is in sports. So if you're providing 100 scholarships for men for football or whatever, you have to provide a fairly equal number to women for sports as well. So this Title IX will be added to this federal funding bill for universities, and this is going to increase the number of women participating in college as well. So not as direct gains and not all political gains like we see with the civil rights movement. Again, some are going to come about as from these technological developments, but this sort of women's rights movement that will come along will also lead to increased opportunities for women. So again, the civil rights movement not going to correct everything. You're obviously still going to have racism exist, but it is going to start to address some of these inequalities, and a lot of them have existed since Reconstruction, and obviously before that, Civil War and slavery. So civil rights movement is going to go a long way to addressing inequalities.